Okay, thank you all for joining us. Dana Wilcott with Pflugerville ISD. I'm the Family Services Coordinator. I am here with Kate Meyer from Ensemble Therapy as we talk about demystifying and navigating school programs. If you notice in the chat, there is a link to our YouTube channel that has other programs that you guys may deem relevant for you. And without further ado, I shall introduce Kate to take it away. Hi, Kate. Thank you for being with us again today. We greatly appreciate you.
Absolutely. Hi. So I am going to pop up a picture of myself so you can see what I look like. So my name is Kate. I am the parent coordinator and coach at Ensemble Therapy. I am also a licensed specialist in school psychology. So we're going to be talking about school psychologists a little bit later in the presentation. But I currently do private assessments as a school psychologist. And I also do different assessments through some public schools as an independent evaluator. All right, so if you guys will just pop in the chat really quick and let me know kind of like the age range of your kids, just so I can kind of tailor the presentation that way. If you just let me know, like elementary or 10, 11, like whatever ages they are, so I can see and make sure I answer questions. Got it. Okay.
So we have 6-year-old, 7-year-old, elementary, 6 to 8. Looks like a lot of our audience are the younger age groups. We've got a middle school. Yeah, 7 and 9, mostly elementary here, elementary and middle school.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So no high school though. I have
one freshman. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, super. All right. So first I'm going to give a little legal disclaimer for this presentation. So I am basically going to be providing my understanding, or our as Ensemble's understanding, of the Texas Education Agency, IDEA, and 504 laws. If you have any further legal questions, contact a special education lawyer, or you can also, we're going to give you some information towards the end of the presentation about who in Pflugerville to contact. But again, I am not a lawyer. I'm giving you my interpretation and my understanding. And so kind of with that, just have that caveat in mind. Today, what we are going to be covering is we're going to talk about the different criteria required for children to qualify for 504 special education, gifted and talented, and then also dyslexia. Technically, dyslexia goes under 504 and it also goes under special education, but I put it as a standalone because it so often comes up as a question about dyslexia. And then we're also going to talk about how you guys can kind of recognize your own legal rights and review the responsibilities of public education and all that it can provide for you. And then also discover helpful ways to advocate for your child's academic needs. And those are the different parts we're going to cover. The big takeaways are, as parents, your job is to be informed and to advocate for your child. That's often a question that comes up towards the end of the presentation. So I put it at the front end, is like, well, I just don't want to upset anyone, or I don't know what to say and what's not okay to say. And it's always okay to advocate for your child as long as you do so in a respectful manner. All right, so first up, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Section 504. And so this is something that's often referred to as 504 services, Section 504. And it is basically part of this Rehabilitation Act from the 1970s. And what it is it's a civil rights law, okay? And so it is a federal law. And so our states interpret it and our district interprets it in different ways. Basically, 504 is your minimal amount of accommodations that you can get that are separate from the general education population. And the point of it is it's supposed to help children get equal access to their educational needs or rights by providing some things that the teachers can do in the classroom. There is not a separate amount. We're going to talk in a little bit about special education, and that is different. And it's different because they come from different kind of pots of money. And so 504, if your child is receiving special education services, they cannot receive 504 services as well. What would happen instead is that their 504 accommodations or needs would be rolled into their special education individualized education plan, which again, we'll talk about later, but it is separate. That's something that comes up as a question a lot. So the big takeaway from this is that the child can receive accommodations or modifications to their general education environment. So what that means is that 504 is not someone coming into the classroom to provide those accommodations for your child, typically, although there's a little caveat with dyslexia, and we'll talk about that. It's not pull out. It means that the general education teacher is doing things in the classroom to provide those accommodations or modifications for your child. I'm going to talk specifically about what those can be, not the next slide, but the one after that. So basically, who is eligible for 504 or who can be referred for 504, who makes those referrals. So basically, anybody can make a referral for Section 504. Anybody can. There's some more specific people that can make referrals for special education, but for 504, anybody. And basically the district needs to have reason to believe via a referral from the parent or, a community member that the child is in need of services under this Section 504 due to a disability. And so I'm going to use that kind of language, not a person first language per se, but the language that the law uses, which unfortunately isn't person first, but just to kind of keep consistent with that language. Okay. And so anybody under Section 504 it's two-prong, okay? It's a physical or mental impairment. Again, not that person first language, but that substantially limits the learning or another major life activity. So basically, something that limits them from gaining everything that they can possibly gain from their public education or general education environment, okay? So the most common one that we see in schools is if your child is diagnosed with ADHD by your doctor, then often parents will take that doctor's diagnosis to the school and say that they want to have those Section 504 or 504 accommodations for their child for their ADHD. And so what that is that's a physical impairment that substantially limits their learning. And so the doctor would have to fill that out. They have a pretty standard form that they use. Another person that can provide those different kind of requirements or notes for Section 504 are counselors. Sometimes people ask if they're seeing a private counselor. If they can do it, they can. Occupational therapists can. And in fact, you don't even have to, the Texas Education Agency says you don't even have to have a formal diagnosis, but instead they will provide those accommodations if there's a suspected need. So there's no formal diagnosis that actually has to occur. Although for the paperwork components that it makes it a lot easier to receive those accommodations. And also if there's any insurance involved privately for you medically, a diagnosis does help. So basically, oopsies, I see I made a mistake there. Oops, sorry, clicking over. Ah. So basically, let me go back to the slide. I'm having a little blurb here. So basically, who is eligible? I'll talk about that on the next slide over here. So the person that is eligible for those different pieces, like we said, is anyone that has a physical or mental impairment that interferes with their daily living. So this can also be if your child is diagnosed with diabetes and they need some accommodations throughout their day. That can be another person that qualifies under Section 504. If you qualify under Section 504, the accommodations that you can receive are environmental, organizational, behavioral, presentation, or evaluation methods, which basically means testing accommodations, which is the big one as people get into that high school, college age level. And these are accommodations that are provided in the general education setting. Now, the kind of caveat or standalone is dyslexia. So there was, and this is just really because of the historical components surrounding dyslexia, and how it was initially diagnosed and who made the diagnosis and how those accommodations were provided for. And so now each district is interpreting that information in different ways. Some children in some districts are provided special education accommodations for their dyslexia. Some districts say it depends on how severe the dyslexia is for us to determine if we're going to provide those accommodations under Section 504 or under the special education umbrella. And I believe that's the way that you guys, your district, interprets that. So basically what that is if your child is evaluated for or diagnosed privately with dyslexia, they can receive accommodations, either reading therapy or just accommodations in the classroom setting for their dyslexia under 504. That's the only one that there's that typical pullout. Some students that are diagnosed with diabetes or a physical or need any sort of physical support during the day, but it's not significant enough that it needs to be provided by a person that is paid privately, but can be provided by the school nurse. They will also receive some pullout services through Section 504. But oftentimes, if the needs become so significant that they require more funding or a person to provide those services, then it is often served under special education, which we're going to talk about towards the end more.
Hey, we have a question about dysgraphia. Would that be the same as dyslexia? Would they receive like the same type of accommodations with their general ed teacher?
Yep. So dysgraphia is kind of an interesting one that different states interpret in different ways. So technically there was an update to the dyslexia handbook, which dysgraphia is also talked about in the fall of 2021. And it's always so hard with time now in this like COVID world, right? I'm trying to remember all the different time periods. But in the fall of 2021, they came out with an update to the handbook in which they took dysgraphia and they took dyslexia and they paired them with the specific learning disabilities. And so some of the districts in reaction to that are qualifying children for special education if they have dysgraphia or dyslexia. Some districts are still maintaining that those are 504 accommodations. And so if your child is diagnosed with dysgraphia, oftentimes I would say like still like probably 90% of the time, that's going to be served in the general education classroom. And what that means is they're going to have some of those evaluation method accommodations. And then also sometimes some organizational strategies that are utilized differently. They can have access to voice to text, or they can keyboard something or something with spelling as well. They'll get those accommodations in the classroom setting. That answer that question, Dana? Okay.
Cool. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about gifted students, and then we're going to talk about special education students. Okay. So first, the question that comes up is your child bright or are they gifted? Okay. And the way that the law determines it, the way that the popular kind of opinion is determining things, and the way that different people utilize basically their own knowledge of what their school districts have to offer and navigate those systems. Okay. So a giftedness isn't recognized by like the American Association of Pediatrics, nor the DSM, which is kind of our like diagnostic manual that we use as psychologists. There's not really an academic recognition as far as the funding component that's widely accepted, and everyone does the same thing across the whole state of Texas, where there is for special education, because they're utilizing some of those formal federal laws. So basically, I'm going to talk about gifted education and talk about it, but there's going to be some questions or caveats that I'll do my best to answer, but every district and every state and everyone kind of interprets it differently because it's not written out very clearly. Similar to the 504 accommodations, there's a lot of like general and broad terms that everyone is left to interpret themselves. Okay. So when we're looking at bright versus gifted, okay, there's nothing wrong with being just a bright child, okay? Just like there's nothing wrong with being a gifted child, but I do think that there's sometimes in some places some social excitement that occurs if their child meets a gifted criteria, okay? So basically, your bright child is your kid that is always like raising their hand for what the teacher's asking. They're always standing at the front of the line. They're your teacher's helper. They are, you know, kind of like the goody two shoes. Oftentimes, those are your really bright kids. Okay. Your gifted kid is the kid that's sitting in the back. That's like, why is there a line? And, you know, the bright kid loves being told what to do by the teacher. The gifted kid really likes self-directed learning. They're the ones that sometimes are trouble in class, and they're described as so smart, but they just don't get their work done. Things like that. And so oftentimes, like, gifted kids need some sort of accommodations, which is what they can be provided for with the gifted education, not just to help further their academic strengths, but also to support in some districts and many districts that social emotional part for them, because that's often something that they struggle with. Basically, like the good way that I like to differentiate about it is that your bright kid knows the answer. Your gifted kid is going to be the one that asks the questions. They're ones that are often like very quick at grasping things without even being taught it. They're putting together pieces that you as an adult may be like, oh, I didn't even think about putting that together like that. Your bright kids often enjoy learning. Your gifted kids don't always. It might be teacher dependent. You might have a really great kindergarten year and a really tough first grade year because the teacher just doesn't get them. That's kind of how you can differentiate between the bright versus gifted. The testing process differs across different districts. This is my understanding of the way it works in your district, and the way it works in many districts is basically the beginning part is you refer your child, or your teacher refers your child for the gifted portfolio process. Oftentimes there's going to be some checklists and surveys that you as a parent are going to complete, your child's going to complete if appropriate, and their teacher is going to complete. Then there's going to be a work portfolio put together. Some districts say whoever makes the referral puts together the portfolio. Some districts say it's the teacher, and some districts say it's the parent. Often what I see is it's a collaboration of both teacher and parents putting together the portfolio of that gifted work. Okay. This is something that has gotten a lot easier in the age of cell phones. When I first was in the classroom, we were, photocopying, and it was a mess. Then there's a testing process. So different districts use different tests. The most common test that's utilized is one called the COGAT, which I always think is funny because it sounds like a cat. But basically what that is going to be doing is the kids take it online now, and it's going to ask them some different questions to try to ascertain, basically, like there's a verbal reasoning component that helps them, it asks like different questions about how they navigate language, and understand language. And then there's a quantitative reasoning portion, which basically takes like some mathematical components and trying to assess something called their fluid reasoning, which is like your novel problem solving, which we know kids that are gifted are often very, very good at. And so basically it takes those two parts. There is a nonverbal portion that occurs as well, that has them look at like different pictures and spatial reasoning components. And so it basically takes its like general intellectual ability, which they don't typically use the general score, but more look at the different areas. And so the school will take those results and then they'll review them and basically have a committee together that will determine if the child meets that criteria as a gifted child in the school district. I'm going to talk about what happens if your child qualifies and then what happens if they don't qualify. Okay. So once they qualify, there's going to be, I see I made a typo. There's going to be a determination for the school district to basically different districts decide how they want to utilize that information. Okay. So before that even occurs, you as a parent can determine if you want to accept or deny the services. Okay. That's your right. You can go through the whole portfolio process and at the very end be like, nope, we're going to deny these services. And that's up to you. Okay. Once your child is qualified as gifted and talented, the district is required by the Texas Education Agency to provide like an array of learning opportunities. So some districts provide that both in the classroom setting, and then some provide it outside of the classroom setting as well in that kind of pull-out program. Similar to that differentiation I was talking about with 504 and special education, if your child receives special education services, but also qualifies as gifted, that gifted and talented accommodations are going to be rolled into your child's individualized education plan. And that's not, sometimes people will be like, well, that doesn't make sense, but it's actually not uncommon. There's a, it's not a formal qualification, but it is a qualification called 2E or twice exceptional. And that means that your child is both gifted in some way, but then also qualifies for special education in a way. So it could be that a lot of gifted children there's a comorbidity between that and ADHD, anxiety, some depression as well. And so they might need those special education services to support that social emotional part or behavioral part, whilst also needing those gifted and talented services as well. So the state of Texas does have a plan. This is a question that has come up in the past. They do have a plan for how to serve gifted and talented students. It's just that every district, again, interprets it in their own way. And similar to what I said earlier with those 504 accommodations, it is the language that they can kind of play around with. So, as a gifted learner, your child should receive, and this is just verbiage from them, basically, there should be a modification in the depth, complexity, and pacing of their curriculum. They should have a lot of these different challenging learning experiences. Sometimes some schools interpret that again with that pullout. Other schools will provide those services all in the general education setting. And most teachers, depending on district, are going to be certified as gifted and talented. It's a certification that a lot of teachers receive if they are going through that more standard certification process. So I'll let that kind of verbiage speak for itself rather than reading over it. I'm going to send this. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I've put 2 items in the chat for you guys. The first is the COGAT test that Kate was speaking of. There's a link that goes to a Testing Mom website that is pretty good for some of us in layman's terms on how to understand it and to test our kids. And I also put the link to the Gifted and Talented page of the Pflugerville ISD website so that you can see more of this in action and some of our district plans for gifted and talented. Please use the chat if you have any questions as we go along. I am monitoring them and I will try to answer them as best as we can.
I will say, speaking of what Dana just said, as far as the plans for the districts, I'm not sure if it was in response to, my hypothesis is in response to kind of like that shift and all the changes that have occurred in our educational experience for our kids since the COVID, and there was there was a gap in learning in different parts, and I'm not sure why there's this response to it, but I have noticed across the state of Texas that a lot of districts are starting to recognize the needs of their gifted and talented students in a greater way than ever before, and Pflugerville included. Austin ISD is also making some changes, which is pretty cool too. And so I think it's exciting because there is a kind of an opinion within my field that kids that are on that higher end of the IQ spectrum need just as much support as students who are on a different part of or end of the IQ spectrum, because they also have great needs. And so it's exciting that they're being recognized as well.
I agree. And it's important to note that you can be gifted in one certain area. You don't have to be gifted in everything. So a lot of our P-TECH pathways or CTE program are kind of gearing towards that, you're gifted or talented in one area. Let's kind of develop that. Let's look into that and see how far we can go. So it is evolving and changing, and it's really exciting for these kiddos. And we'll do another one next year before the school year ends on our CTE and our pathways, so we can kind of make that connection between what your student may be gifted in and what the district can offer them at a higher intellectual level to keep challenging those students.
That's awesome. Because that's something that is kind of to go off of that. Like, I think that there is so often we apply for the gifted and talented programs in elementary and they're recognized in elementary, but then there's this kind of like what's next when they move to middle school and high school, and it's often covered by, you know, like AP courses or things like that. So I think that's awesome that you guys have that offering. Okay, so you didn't qualify. That's another big question. Now what? Okay, so there's different things you can do, and kind of like Dana was saying, sometimes some kids that don't qualify, I often will see if like they don't, like they're verbally not very strong, or they are having difficulty focusing and their COGAT scores were just like really low because they had difficulty focusing on the test. That's just not a strength of theirs, but they have all these other gifted areas. So you as a parent can appeal the decision if you so choose. You can recommend them again for testing. It doesn't have to be a one-time shot. Like that's it. You've had your chance. It's not like Hamilton, not just one shot. And so basically I think that there's a benefit to having gone through the steps. If you have this, like the portfolio that's put together for your child is, I think it's really quite remarkable, and it's a great snapshot of your child's ability and time. And it can be a powerful piece to look through with your child. Sometimes I think that it can be a reflective moment too for parents, and showing like, okay, why were we going through this process? Was it because we needed some accommodations for our child? Is there another way that we can get those accommodations for our child? Or it might be, is it because we wanted the teacher to recognize that they have a different learning style and we want them to be supported in that way? And that might just be a conversation with your teacher or your child's teacher. But kind of reflecting on your process in that, and understanding too that although it is a portfolio process, a lot of weight. And so I'm glad that Dana linked the COGAT info is given to that COGAT. And so if you are going to appeal it, making sure you really understand what was assessed for your child and what areas you would like to focus on if you want them to be reevaluated. Okay. I'm going to move on to special education. This is going to take a bulk of the presentation. Does anybody have any questions? I'll scroll over to the chat. Does anybody have any questions about 504 accommodations or gifted and talented before I start talking about IDEA?
So far, one of the biggest things to remember, you guys, is you can be qualified as 504 or special education. You cannot have both. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to reiterate that part.
Mm-hmm. And that's really because, like I said earlier, they're different, they're different areas or zones, but they also have different funding. And so the school districts, the state of Texas doesn't allow for them to kind of cross that funding. And so it has to be really clear of like how this child is being supported and where their funding comes from. Okay. So basically, with IDEA, or the Individuals with Disability Education Act, this is a federal statute that is interpreted by the state of Texas. And this one is pretty specific with the language. And so the districts and the state interpret it in a pretty specific way. And the state of Texas itself has gone through a lot of changes since 2006, really, and how they have viewed the special education evaluation process, and how they interpret that law. I think that a lot of the changes, as someone who works in this field, who does evaluations herself, I think that a lot of the changes have been really good. I think that there's some that I would tweak if I had my own, magic wand and could rule the world. But overall, I think the state is trending in a very positive direction, and I'm optimistic about it. So here's basically the schedule, kind of the list of activities that will occur as you go through this evaluation process. So basically the first step is going to be that intervention. Okay. The next step after we look and see how the response to intervention has been, is going to be the referral and consent portion. And I'm going to go over each of these parts too. Okay. And then it's going to be the evaluation. And then the final step is what we call in the state of Texas an ARD, or an admission review and dismissal. Other states call it an IEP meeting. Basically, you walk away with the exact same thing, which is an IEP, or an individualized education plan. So the whole point of this whole process is, if your child is having difficulty in school, academically, behaviorally, the whole process is supposed to end with a plan if they qualify or meet any areas of eligibility, and we'll talk about those too. For special education, then they'll walk away with an individualized education plan. Okay. So, all right. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is called RTI, or response to intervention. Basically, so this is something that the state has kind of shifted and changed a little bit. And now it just goes by a lot of different names. Okay. So basically it is, if a child is having difficulty in school, a teacher will, and this is just something that teachers will do to support your children, is they will create an intervention and then see how your child responds to it. Okay. So, probably like, 2006 is what I mentioned before, where I saw the first kind of shift occur. And basically that is when we used to say, hard and fast, your child needs to have 6 to 9 weeks to respond to this intervention. And you as a teacher have to take all this data. Pflugerville was great at their data. Round Rock was great at their data. Like you have to take all this data and we graph it out and we see how they respond to it. Some opinions and we're like, that's way too long. Like some kids need that intervention or possibly special education support earlier. Some kids really do need that, or they need longer. And so that part of the response to intervention has become a lot more flexible as far as like looking to see what kind of intervention your child needs and their response to it. The whole kind of point of it, like I said, is to give them that chance to respond basically to an intervention, not just moving straight to an evaluation without ever trying anything in the classroom setting first. Okay. So now the question is it required like it used to be? And the answer is no. Now the schools can't really require, but it should be taken into consideration. And the reason that I spend this time and am kind of finicky about this is because this part has been debated so much in my field, and so many people have such a strong viewpoints on it. And so really just now different things are kind of, we call them requested. So basically like any tutorials, like what has your child been given that their general education peer who doesn't need special education, what have they been given that's different, right? So have they been given like before, after school tutoring? Have they had a response to intervention? Has the teacher had to remediate something for them? Meaning like they take what they're able to do in the classroom setting or their peers are able to do and made it simpler. Have they had any other sort of academic or behavioral support services? And then has there been any sort of compensatory services? Basically like, have you been doing any sort of outside tutoring, or have they gone to, we call it like extended school year? What has occurred that that the child has received that has given them that extra support that might show that they need that special education, if I explain it as best as I can explain it. If anyone has any questions, we can talk about that one at the end because it can get very complex. But basically, like I said, short answer is no, they don't technically need to have any sort of response intervention anymore. It's just, we just want to know what they need that's above and beyond their general education peers. Basically, why are you asking for a special education services plan? Okay, so now who can make the referral? This is a little bit different than the 504 services or even gifted and talented. So basically anyone that's school personnel can make this referral, okay? That's like general education teacher, special education teacher, counselor, administrators, anyone can make the referral. Also the child's parent or legal guardians, as well as any person involved in the care or education of the child. So you think like that pretty much covers anyone that has their eyes or anything on the child, but they differentiated in the paperwork because special education likes to have a lot of things covered as far as the paperwork components. And so those are the people that can make referrals for special education. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the consent and evaluation process as far as timelines that are laid out by the state of Texas. Okay. So basically the consent is very specifically gained with the following people. Okay. There's going to be an administrator present. There's going to be an evaluator or a school psychologist or educational diagnostician or a speech language pathologist. Typically it's the person that is going to be doing the evaluation, but it is not always the case. There will also be a teacher, and then the parent or whoever has basically like signing privileges for the child's educational rights is going to be there as well. If the parent is unable to show up, the school will make 3 attempts to try to have the parent show up. If you can't be there in person, now we'll do a virtual meeting. We'll talk over the phone. You as the parent or the person that is signing off on that process is required to be there. If you are not there, it cannot move forward. And that is because you are your child's advocate and you are the person that controls whether this evaluation can take place. Okay. Typically what will happen in that meeting is they are dependent on length, depending on like what the request is for and how much intervention has been already attempted. But oftentimes they'll review the response to the intervention and then everyone kind of brainstorm next steps. Oftentimes, if you are sitting in a consent meeting, the next step is going to be a special education evaluation, but not always. And so then it'll be documented because it'll be kind of the first step. And different districts have different documentation systems. I'm going to talk about this at the end, but I'm also going to say it right here. It's so important for you as a parent to have all of the documentation. The district is going to have all of this as PDFs. I highly suggest you just make a folder on your computer and say at the end of everything, can I have a PDF of that? And if the meeting has not been summarized in any way, which often it will be, then you as the parent can take it upon yourself to email everybody a summary of your interpretation of the meeting. Okay. But really making sure as parents, even in the best, I'm not saying for any situation like, oh, you need to make sure you have all your paperwork, just any situation that there's going to be a long-term process, it's always a really good idea to have that documentation kind of all set. And it's also really nice too, because if your child, if they have more complex needs and there might be an occupational therapist involved and a speech language pathologist and, and then a school psychologist like myself, it's important for you to know all of their names, all of their email addresses, who said they're going to do what, and having that all documented is really important. Okay. So the evaluation, so the state of Texas says that from the date that the consent is signed, the evaluator has 45 school days. Okay. And so you can ask them because they'll often have it written on the consent paperwork, what that date the evaluation is due, but that's when the evaluation should be returned to you, like completed and given to you. Okay. You as the parent have no dictation or any sort of rights that basically say like, I want it done in this time, or you don't get to choose that. You just could know that at the very end, it's going to come to you after 45 school days. That's when you'll receive the evaluation. Something else that sometimes comes up is, what if I decide that I don't want the evaluation to occur anymore and I want to take away my consent, or I want to revoke my consent? Basically, anything gained at that point in the evaluation cannot be destroyed because it's part of their educational record. So that cannot be destroyed, it cannot be put away. It's part of that record, but you can stop it from that point. The other question that parents often ask is, if I say, okay, yes, you can do this evaluation, does that mean my kid's going to be in special education? And no, you are the parent, you are the advocate, you have consented to the evaluation only after the end of the evaluation, you'll receive the report, and then the school will have, like I have in there, 30 calendar days to schedule the admission, review, and dismissal, which again is called an IEP meeting in a different district, but in the state of Texas, we call it admission, review, and dismissals, okay? In that admission, review, and dismissal, which we're going to talk about, not in the next slide, but the one after that, that's where you will decide at the very end if you want your child to receive special education services, okay? So under TEA, there's different areas of eligibility that your child can qualify for or meet, okay? So I think it's easy to kind of, I'll walk through them a little bit. I tried to sort them, but then I also realized that it can be a little overwhelming to look at. There's a lot of different areas. Now, Texas is a label-driven state, which means that in order to receive special education services in the state of Texas, your child has to qualify for one of these areas. They can't just get services because we see that there's a need. They have to meet this eligibility, okay? So there's autism, and this is a separate set of criteria than ASD or autism spectrum. That's a medical diagnosis. This is an educational. So there are some areas of overlap, but there is separate components. So if your child, let's say, is privately tested and the person that privately tests them says that they are diagnosed with ASD or autism spectrum disorder, then you can't just walk to the school and say, okay, my child has autism, you know, they need special education services. Because what the school will say is, thank you so much for letting us know this. We're going to go through the special education evaluation process to determine if your child has an educational need. So there's that differentiation. There's a medical need, and then there's an educational need. There are a lot of students that have ASD that do not need special education services, okay? And so there's that differentiation. There's also speech impairment. There's private speech services, and then there are educational speech services. Again, is there an educational need? An intellectual disability and a learning disability. The intellectual disability means that basically there's two different points that we are looking at. If their IQ is at or below a certain point, and then also if their adaptive needs demonstrate that they need beyond what their peers need in areas of communication or social or motor. The point of that special education support is to give them those services that they need. A learning disability is one that many people are familiar with, and learning disabilities can be in reading, like basic reading, reading fluency, reading comprehension, math problem solving, math calculation, or written expression. And so basically what those services often look like is they're pulled from the classroom setting or given support in the classroom setting in their area of need so that they can get those extra services and get the point of that is to get caught up to their general education peers so that they don't need those special education services any longer. An emotional disturbance is one that basically means that there's different qualifying criteria, but the general kind of component is something is impacting them emotionally or behaviorally that's stopping them from accessing what they need to get educationally. So this could mean their anxiety is so significant that they are unable to come to school, or they won't leave the car in the morning and they need extra support, or they need routine check-ins throughout their day. It doesn't always have to tie to a clinical diagnosis either. A TBI or a traumatic brain injury, if your child has had one and it's so significant that it impacts them educationally, then they can qualify for special education services. And other health impairment is another one that's very common. It's often associated with ADHD. It basically means that there's something impacting your health to the point that you're unable to gain, again, kind of you're getting that repetitiveness, what you need to gain from your general education setting without special education support. So it might mean that this is kind of like if you have those 504 services and your child is still really struggling academically, and you're like, gosh, like we have this ADHD diagnosis, they're still really struggling with 504 services, then that's often a time when special education services are considered. Like, okay, maybe we need to build in some more structure and framework and supports into their day for them to be successful. There is also visual, orthopedic, or auditory impairments. Those are a little bit more specific per medical needs. But those are other areas that are supported under special education services. We also have, it's called non-categorical, or more formally referred to as NCEC. But basically what that means is non-categorical early childhood. So prior to the age of 6, if your child has a need that is significant, but we're not really sure as evaluators, like what exactly those needs are, but we can see the needs and we know they need special education services, then we can get those services provided to them under the NCEC area eligibility criteria, but there'll be another evaluation before they turn 6, because by their 6th birthday, they have to meet another area of eligibility should they need to continue those special education services. There's also the qualifying areas of deaf, blindness, and then multiple disabilities, which might mean that you have multiple areas of disability, okay? So those are the areas in the state of Texas that you have to qualify for in order to receive special education services. So in talking through the actual ARD process, what is going to occur in that meeting is there will be, you'll already have reviewed the evaluation with your evaluator. And then in the meeting itself, they will have created goals for your child, and then they will have created a schedule for your child. Now, sometimes parents say, I'll answer your question, Brandy, in a second. Sometimes parents will say, well, can I understand, like, can we have access to the ARD paperwork before the meeting? Or I just don't, it's gonna be so much information. And I will be honest, it is a rare meeting if it ends and the parents don't look like deer in the headlights, because it's a lot of information. It can be very overwhelming. Okay. So you have the right as a parent to ask, but it doesn't have to be given to you. Ask for a draft of the ARD paperwork, meaning that, like, hey, before the meeting, can I get a draft to see what you guys are going to cover? Okay. Some special education teachers might be willing to give, we call it a pre-ARD. So basically, like, before the ARD meeting, they would go over all the paperwork with you and walk you through it. That is something that is, special education teachers are very overworked and they have huge caseloads and they're teaching all day and they have a lot of paperwork. So it is a lot for them to do even like a pre-ARD. So it's often time-based, but they might be able to do that. The other thing is at the end of the ARD, you'll be asked to sign saying, yes, I consent to this. Either my child being moved into special education services, or basically the paperwork saying, like, they've already been in special education services. This is an annual ARD, but here's the schedule change we're looking at. So technically, you as a parent do not need to sign that paperwork in that meeting. If you need to take it home and process it, whatever you need to do, however much time you need to take. But the caveat is that they will not receive those special education services until you sign it. So sometimes parents are like, well, I want them to receive it tomorrow, but I don't know everything that this paperwork says. And so that's why it's really important to try to access that paperwork beforehand, if at all possible. Okay. The other piece that I want to talk about with this, again, is, I said it before, make a binder. If you're not a computer person, if you are, make an electronic copy. The school district is going to have everything electronically. Okay. It's very easy for them to have that because they're required to for their documentation system. So if you are, if you're okay with it being on the computer, it is so easy just to say, will you please email me this? Will you please email me that? And they will absolutely do that. And then you also have your documentation kind of chain there as well. Know that in the meeting, sometimes parents get very worried or stressed before the meetings, or they're worried, like, my kids' rights aren't going to be, I'm like so concerned about all these pieces. Like, know that the special education teacher or case manager that's been assigned to your child, the principal, like, and your child's general education teacher, that their goals are what's best for your child. That, as someone who's been a teacher, that is ultimately our goal, always. So know that everyone is coming from that good place and wanting those positive things. Time is always a tricky thing. It is hard to navigate time in this educational setting because I feel like we never have enough. But know that everyone's intentions are always coming from, or at least starting from that really good place. I'm going to answer Brandy's question. She asked, would processing issues such as visual processing fall under the visual, orthopedic, and auditory impairment? That's the same thing as the medical versus educational, and that's one that's come up a lot. So sometimes some children that are struggling with reading, one of the questions that come up is it a visual processing difficulty? And so they can go and receive vision therapy. And then the question is, does that translate? So you can receive 504 services for that, or 504 accommodations, but for special education, it has to be so significant that it impacts that educational basically like that educational performance or educational functioning to the point that they need special education support, like additional person, like an IEP, a whole big part. So it'd have to be very severe. Okay, so something that often will come up in an ARD meeting is something called the least restrictive environment, or we call it LRE. And you'll hear it referred just all the time. People use that acronym and parents are like, what does that mean? So I made a whole slide for it. So basically, your least restrictive environment is the environment that the child can be in that is, not to be redundant, the least restrictive, okay? So the least possible restrictive environment is your general education setting, okay? And that's where you want the child to be for most of the time, as much of the day as they possibly can be. You do not not you as in like you as in a person, but like you as far as best practice and research, as much as we understand, is the pull-out setting can be beneficial if we want to get that child remediation caught up and they're, distracted by environmental stimuli, or they need these additional supports that can only be done in this pull-out setting. That's okay, but we don't want them pulled out that much. We want them as much as possible in that LRE, or least restrictive environment. That's why a lot of the supports that are going to be provided are going to be done in, we call it inclusion support or push-in support. And that means that a special education teacher is going to go into the classroom setting and support your child. And so when your case managers are calculating the child's schedule and how much they're pulled out, they're looking at that LRE. I want them in the classroom in their least restrictive environment as much as possible for as much of the time, so that they can hopefully improve and will not need those special education services, because that's the point of special education, is to get out of special education. Okay, child find is something else that comes up in this whole conversation. And that is basically the purpose of child find is to identify and evaluate any child birth to 21 and provide them their possible supports or special education that they might need, or any sort of related services. We often hear child find a lot when you are in the birth to 3 range. That's when you will typically start to get some services. And then in the 3 to 6 age range, if your child is in age 3 to 6, that's when the school district takes over basically and provides any sort of special education services your child might need. So if your child is not speaking as you would expect by age 3, then the school district can do an evaluation and then provide some preschool program services through special education. And the point of that child find and that service basically is that we know early intervention is key, okay? And we, as far as like educators know this, we as far as psychologists know this, we know that the earlier the intervention can occur, the more beneficial it is, the shorter it can be, and oftentimes that early intervention might be all that child needs. And so child find is incredibly important. They extended to 21 years because that is the age that you would be dismissed technically from special education, is on the eve of your 21st birthday. Something that often comes up is IEPs in college. So how does that work? And I know I'm running close to the end of my time, and I have this slide and then one more slide. And so I'll be super brief and fast. Okay. There's a lot to cover. So, okay. You cannot carry your IEP with you to college. So what will happen is if your child is in special education and they have an IEP, then when they are a senior, they will be exited from special education, or we call it sometimes a graduation ARD. They'll be graduated from special education if they're going to be going to a college. And then they'll be basically, you'll have your graduation or transitional ARD. And then at the end of that ARD, immediately you'll have a 504 meeting, and your child will be entered into 504 accommodations or services, because those they can take to college. Now, all colleges are different, and I can't speak to all the colleges in the world, but typically what the colleges like to see is they like to see recent paperwork within a reasonable amount of time. And though that kind of paperwork also is going to be helpful if you're taking any tests for college or anything like that. What will happen is, as your child is applying to college, they will also be contacting the services for students with disabilities, and then they'll be setting up their academic accommodations through that department. But they cannot have their IEP in college or their individualized education plan. It's going to be a 504 plan instead. Okay, so basically my takeaways of how do you best advocate for your child is ask a lot of questions. Don't feel like you're going to be the squeaky wheel. Ask questions. Obviously, do so in a compassionate way. I find that showing up with Starbucks or any sort of homemade thing, or even sticky notes. Teachers, I mean, it's kind of they love sticky notes. It's so or fun to get new pens, or I'm not saying you have to give gifts to but I'm saying if you're emailing excessively, then it might be nice to also a little drop of kindness is always appreciated, right? So ask those big questions. The other thing is get really specific, okay? Ask if you are worried that someone is not giving your child their accommodations, and this happens sometimes with 504, talk with them hey, I know the 504 plan that you probably got a big stack of them. So I just kind of made a little takeaway for my kids' 504 plan. And here's the things that they need, or here's what we've discovered in years past for them to be really successful. Really just get specific for the needs that you have for your child. Okay. The other thing is, address the really sticky situations head on. Talk to your teacher first, or teachers first. Be specific, ask these questions. They'll have answers for it. And if you ask it in a kind, non-judgmental way, you're going to get pretty typically a kind, non-judgmental answer. But knowing how you can have the answers to these questions so that you can really support your child at home and know that your child's needs are being met, that's the best. The hardest situations are the ones that I come into when it's well, I don't know. I haven't talked to the teacher, but here's what my kid's saying. And then I emailed 3 times and I didn't hear back. And now it's just all these hurt feelings, or all these things that are just kind of blown a little bit out of proportion. And so just making sure there's that consistent communication, and like I said, just really addressing them head on.
And to add on to that, Kate,
Yes.
A lot of why I do what I do, from a school counselor working with families, being an administrator, to the position I currently have, which is where I kind of put all of those pieces and tools together, is we all want what's best for your kid, right? So I have found that working with the school and with our parents at home, following the same routines, doing the same thing at home that we do in the evening, following that same sort of positive behavior system, whatever it may be, is what's best for the kid. So share that with your teacher. If you're using if he does this, this, and this 4 times a week during the week, he gets a prize. Okay, cool. Let's add a couple of those components from the classroom and put them on that list. Or vice versa. If we're going towards a goal, share what your goals are with your teacher for that your student at home, and let's kind of see how we can bridge that gap so that they see it's like this is just kind of how it flows together. This is life. There's not like a school life or a home life. This is just how we do things because we're working together for you and for what's best for your kiddos. And once Kate's done, I'm going to show you guys a little bit of the website so you can kind of see where to navigate some things. It'll only take a minute, so thank you guys for being here.
And do you mind if I answer the questions really quick too, as you're you're starting to, okay. I'll stop sharing so that you can start sharing, and then I'm going to answer the questions too. Okay. So Jennifer asked, who's responsible for identifying the accommodations needed on the 504 plan or IEP? Can parents make requests? So yes, you as a parent can absolutely, kind of like Dana was saying, you as a parent can absolutely make requests or share ideas. Typically it is especially for the IEP, it's the special education case manager. What they're supposed to be doing and typically are doing is they look at the evaluation and the evaluator will make recommendations. And then from those recommendations or areas of need, they'll create goals. If you kind of along the lines again of what Dana was saying are like, I know what my kid needs and I know what they can, what works really well at home, tell them before the ARD and let them know so that they can add it to the ARD. I always find that any way that you can give advanced warning to any changes that you want to make, the further in advance you can do it, the better. It's often harder in those meetings because sometimes people are like, they have a time limit or they have so much paperwork to get through. And so I often just really highly, highly suggest doing it beforehand and emailing it again. So you have that documentation.
Also save it. I know Kate said several times, save your information. You never know when life changes happen. If you are enrolling at a new school, if you have to leave schools very quickly, when you show up to your new school with all of your child's IEP paperwork, the ARD, it's a lot easier to transition them and to keep them on that same pattern they had before. Whereas if you go and enroll your student new district and you don't have all of that paperwork, it can sometimes take a while for us to gather that information.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up with the system that we use to get across the state of Texas information is one called TRECS, like T-RECS, like obviously records. Texas records. But we used to joke that it was T-Rex because it was like a dinosaur, and we're like, why is it so slow? Like it should be so much faster. So agreed. Tagging on what Dana said, like any sort of way that you can have access to that. So you can say, here's my kid, here's what they've had in the past, here's what works really well, is so, so helpful.
Yeah, we want to do what's best for kids, and being able to know exactly what their needs are from day one when they walk into the classroom is huge. Another point, if we make a game plan in your IEP and we have goals and they're not working, you can always go back to ARD and we can change it. Some things just don't work. Don't get upset, frustrated. Just say, you know what, this isn't working. Can we take a look at this again and try something different? Happens all the time. We want to do what's best for our kiddos. But if you go to the Pflugerville ISD website and you click on departments and then you click on special education, this is where it'll take you to the special education services page. And you'll see all of these resources right here listed, where you can quickly toggle over anything you need to find more information on. If you look on the side, you'll see the acronyms guide. There's a lot of acronyms, you guys, and we totally get it. Here's kind of where you can see, like, if you see these abbreviations, what in the world does that actually mean? You've got a guide right here. And then here's some of the instructional programs and services that we offer, from like speech therapy to 3-year-olds, which is part of the Child Find, the Pegasus classroom. You've got school age, transition services, behavior support services, speech language services, instructions for students with vision impairment. And then there's also contacts, like who do I call? Who do I contact if I need any help with any of these services? It's all right here on this page for you guys to access. I also want to show you the YouTube page. So this is our parent and family engagement YouTube page. We started doing videos because of COVID, and it has gotten a lot of traction, and our parents love to be able to access these videos. So this is what the page looks like. I'm going to put the link in the chat box so you guys can join our subscribers, so we can get our subscribers up. These are some of the ones that we've done last year and so far this year, and we're going to keep adding to it so that we have videos and topics covering any area that you guys could possibly need, because we want to be partners in education for you. And if y'all need any assistance on anything, I'm going to put my information in the chat box as well, so that you can send me an email. Let me know what you think about this recording, or what you guys need to know more about. We're here for you, and we want to support and serve you guys. And I know Kate will be able to give her information as well.
I added my email as well. But again, if you have any specific questions that are more in that legal kind of realm, I absolutely suggest, contacting, first start with your school, and then moving to, if needed, like a lawyer that specializes in special education law, or an advocate. But the best place to start is your home school.
Yeah, thank you guys for all being here. Please send us any questions. So once this recording is completed, I will send you guys a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording in your email. Thank you all. We appreciate you guys. Thank you for your time. Thank you all so much. Have a good day.
Thank you, and to you.